How can servant leadership help boards and board members to encounter their weaknesses and then help to heal and perhaps to overcome them? Is this something you see as being relevant to the policy governance model?
Whether servant leadership plays a role in helping heal whatever's going on, say, within a board, I've never quite thought about it that way. But when I stop to think about it, perhaps there are ways. For example, the model focuses people on the conflict of issues as opposed to the conflict of people. And perhaps that sounds a little strange. Let me explain it this way. Policy governance, what I've built into it, is a counsel to boards to see themselves as present at the board table to disagree, not present to agree. If they're there to agree, we only need one person and we can pass the board job. George is the board in February and Sally's the board in March. The thing is, we have them together to disagree. And we don't even have them together to disagree just to the extent of the board members' disagreements. They come together to bring the disagreement and the variety of opinions of an ownership. So if in fact an ownership point of view is not actually held by one of the board members, it should still find expression in the board process. So for the board to really do its job in being a servant to the ownership, and then let that turn into the leadership of that which the ownership owns, the organization, it must incorporate things that go beyond the small-mindedness, if I might say it that way, of George and Sally disagreeing, or Mary and Harry, and so forth. It's beyond that. It's something bigger than that. It's something bigger than that. And that bigness helps get out of the person-to-person kind of confrontation. It's more a confrontation of ideas, and that's what we're here to do. So let's be about it.
Good. Robert Greenleaf talked a lot about some characteristics of servant leadership. One of them was foresight. And I'm curious to ask you, what's your own sense of the use of foresight within a board context? That's an awfully vague question. What can boards or board chairs in particular do in terms of exercising some heightened sense of foresight to help organizations?
Foresight is not just one of the characteristics of a board. It is almost the total engagement of a board. The board should be dealing with the future, and its future as far out as makes sense. For example, the board of a nuclear power plant shouldn't be dealing with a 5-year future. The board of a small counseling agency might, in fact, be dealing with a 5-year future, or 10. So foresight is really what the game's all about with a board. The board is there to envision and create a future, not to go over last month's financial statements. There are ways of handling that another way. But to create a future, which means foresight is that which plays the what-if game over and over and over. What if this happened? What if that happened? Is the nature of the world around us changing? Maybe we haven't yet, but the world around us changing such that what was not a risk before is now a risk. The idea of vision and grasping the bigness of the world that the organization is moving into. For example, our petroleum companies should have boards which deal with the fact that, hey, certain kinds of operations of ours, should they go wrong, can cause untold damage which might in fact be as great as the total capitalization of our company. And maybe that wasn't even true 20 years ago, but now it's true. So what are we going to do with that? How will we look at that? How will we guide this organization, not only on behalf of the owners, which we must do, but with an ethical obligation to the rest of the world. Now, that takes foresight to the point that it strains imagination that we can even have that much foresight, but that's exactly what's called for. That's what's called for the public schools. It's what's called for relief agencies. It certainly is what's called for city governments, who don't have usually the foresight to talk about the fact that their infrastructure falls apart a little bit more every year, and our accounting is not such that we're laying aside, amortizing in such a way that we're taking care of that. We wait till it all falls apart later. And the foresight is so important that I would say that's the main job of the board.
Another characteristic, and the one that Greenleaf talked about as being of greatest importance or a starting point from his perspective with servant leadership, is listening. Mm-hmm. So in my experience, I've seen a wide degree of listening take place within boards, as I'm sure you have as well. The question here is, what aspects of policy governance model help to encourage greater fealty to listening, or conversely, what are some things that board members, board chairs might be able to do to help their organizations around listening?
I would think that it's impossible to govern with excellence without having a huge investment in listening. Listening, well, let's see. First of all, listening to the ownership. That's where the listening begins, is listening to the ownership. And we have in policy governance a term we often use called ownership linkage, which simply speaks to the obligation of a board to connect itself to the ownership in some way. Sometimes if you have a small ownership, you can actually connect to the individual people. You can survey them. You can have them all in the same room. If you have thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of owners, as many organizations do, who are even nonprofits, certainly equity corporations, then the listening has to be done another way. It has to be done in some way that has statistical validity, so you're not just listening to the loud voices, or the voices that your board members connect with best, but broader listening. So the listening almost has to be taken to a technological level of listening. How do you find out what the values are of 100,000 people about public education if you're a school board? Well, that's your job. Figure it out. And the listening must be done in a very carefully, statistically accurate way in order to have the confidence that you've actually heard. So that's part of it. The other kind of listening is boards have to listen to their staffs. I don't mean listen to their staffs in the sense of being pushed around by them. I don't mean that. Or giving up the obligation they have to, in fact, make decisions on behalf of the owners, not let the staff make the decisions on behalf of the owners at the top level of decision making. But to listen to the wisdom that resides there, because staff have tremendous amount of wisdom that the board can draw on. Not to give up its role, but to enhance its role. So listening plays a big part in governance. It has to. It has to. And the board should probably spend more time listening than it does talking. Maybe by a long shot.
You spoke some years ago about the policy governance model as a kind of technology of servant leadership. Would you share some thoughts or insights about that idea?
Well, I see servant leadership as, and obviously I didn't say this first by any means, but as a way of being, not a pattern, not a set of behaviors necessarily, but a way of being. And it gets translated in behavior. It would have to be. But that behavior will look different in the classroom by a teacher versus in a boardroom by a board versus in the accounting office by a clerk. It looks different. They would do different things out of that being. And policy governance is a technology, if you will, of servant leadership in a specific location, the governing board. So in a sense, it takes, it wasn't built this way. I didn't start with servant leadership to do it, but you could easily see policy governance as being a technology or technique or concretization of servant leadership in a very specific setting.
Okay. The policy governance model has been around for 30 years or more. Have you adjusted the model in some way over the years? And if so, how? Or does it remain unchanged from the beginning?
The model has had a history of development over the last 30 years, but I'd have to break it into two parts, really. The model basically consists of a very few principles, really a handful. They're unfamiliar and so different that people think of it as having so much to be learned, and there is a lot to be learned in terms of making them real. But the principles themselves have stayed pretty much unchanged during that period of time. It turns out that they held water well enough that there haven't been new principles added or some of the old ones tossed out, that kind of thing. That just has not happened. What has happened, however, has been the ability to translate that into action. The ability to design a way of, for example, of getting monitoring information from a staff so that a board can feel reasonably secure that what it has set forth as what it wanted done or what it wanted avoided has, to, in a reasonable interpretation, been achieved. That monitoring process. And we've gotten much, much tighter, much more exacting about the monitoring process. The principle about boards only monitor what they've given a criteria about ahead of time, that you only make judgments when people have had the chance to know ahead of time upon which the judgment will be made, and so forth. Those principles have stayed the same. So I'd have to say that the model itself, qua model, has gone virtually unchanged, has stood the test of time, but the implementation techniques and the learning about how sometimes it's very difficult. It's more difficult than I thought it would be to start with in implementation.